All right, so we've got Aristotle and Freud in the house. We've got at least some of the larger aspects of the ethical and kind of societal considerations on the table, and it will all interweave with the sessions as we go through the rest of the day. The next one is really going to try to focus on the question of the evidence that we have for the value assessment focused on the comparative clinical effectiveness piece. The cost effectiveness we'll talk about in the fourth session later today. So today we're going to grapple with the issues that are raised and kind of summarized in the briefing paper, which is, again, there's a tension. There's a tension that there's a kind of a usual, if you will, this kind of paradigmatic amount or type of evidence that assessors like ICER or payers or others, doctors and patients, I hope, are looking at when trying to make judgments, whether it's a clinical judgment or a policy judgment. And there is an evidence package that's kind of prototypical for an orphan or especially ultra-orphan condition. These are often highlighted by smaller patient populations, questions about whether they can or can't be randomized, questions about whether there is blinding possible as part of the trials, questions about whether you can run a trial for a long time and keep two control arms without having one arm do kind of a delayed crossover. All of these questions around what many people would call the quality or the strength of evidence, in a sense, it's part of the discussion about whether we treat the assessment of orphan and ultra-orphan drugs differently and how we modulate, if at all, the standards. To make it very concrete, I don't have a slide of it, but ICER, again, as I mentioned, we have this evidence rating matrix where we kind of have an internal calibration. We have a common law, if you will, of what we think of as high certainty in an incremental net health benefit. What if we have just moderate or even low certainty a lot of the time for drugs that are approved for rare conditions? Do we keep our rating low, let's say? If we were to use the exact same standards, the exact same framework in our minds, we might call a lot of the evidence on accelerated approval drugs coming out as low evidence. I remember a review done of Sovaldi when it first came out, was first approved. I'm almost sure there was no randomized trial. And I know one distinguished evidence review group in the US said that they felt there was inadequate evidence to believe that Sovaldi was clinically effective. Some people thought that was a mistake, that they needed to modulate their thinking. Yes, there was no RCT, but come on, the old parachute thing, we don't need RCTs on whether parachutes work. We can kind of make do with something less than that. So we're going to try to focus on this, and it's going to come from both directions. It's going to come from discussions of what evidence can be created and also from the direction of how it can be assessed. But the basic goal, again, is to help give us some guiding principles on whether ICER and payers and others should have a different approach to the quality or strength of evidence for rare or ultra-rare drugs. All right? So with that, we've got a distinguished group here. We've got Vanessa Batista, who is a nurse and a pediatric nurse practitioner at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Annie Kennedy, who is the Senior Vice President for Legislation and Public Policy at the PPMD. Clark Paramore, who is the Head of Value Demonstration at Bluebird Bio. David Rind, who is ICER's Chief Medical Officer. Michael Sherman, who is the Chief Medical Officer and Senior Vice President at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, and Perry Shea, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of Neurology at UCLA. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, who wants to kick off? Maybe I could ask the question first of Clark. So you probably get used to payers and groups like ICER around the world saying, can't you give us better evidence? Can we get better evidence? Talk about some of the practicalities that you see, and do you see a way forward in some sense for how assessors should look at the types of evidence packages that you present at or near the time of FDA approval? Now, you're going to want to talk about something that's really important, which is the timing of value assessments. And this is a critical issue that, in a sense, is also weaving through our discussion today. We're talking about whether how we should or shouldn't do value assessments, but the question of when. Since we're always going to have better information years downstream, is there a question of when we use certain approaches as part of the background discussion? But I'm going to, in a sense, force you into a slightly uncomfortable space, which is really important questions about the price and about the use are made right at the time or very near at the time of FDA approval, the first FDA approval. So there are going to have to be efforts to assess the value done at that time. And so we can talk about the different time scales, but part of what I want to force you to think about is, given what we get at the time of approval and when a lot of these decisions need to start to be made, how do we look at the comparative clinical effectiveness information? So Clark.
Is it on now?
It is.
Great. Now, I appreciate the opportunity to speak at this forum today. Yes, Bluebird Bio is part of the adaptive pathways process in Europe with the EMA for our beta thalassemia indication. Single arm, gene therapy, one-time therapy, potentially with a transformative impact over the lifetime of patients. There is no randomized controlled trial, as you mentioned. So part of the discussions have been the best ways to determine, even discussions with EMA, the best ways to determine standard of care information for the disease of interest and to go about, and Bluebird has a process for going about and trying to identify the strongest ways to identify that standard of care as a potential comparator. That's the option that we're working with right now. That'll likely be the case with some of our other indications as well, because it'll be the same situation. Typically, that has been one aspect of the discussions. The other aspect has been length of time of follow-up for our therapies, because it's one time. The durability of effect has come up with these types of therapies. And obviously, we have a plan in place for extensive follow-up, product registries, things like that, but it will take time. Durability will have to be evaluated over time. It's not something that we can necessarily extrapolate for now. So we do, it's the point I think I mentioned with you, we do not question, but if something's going to be distinct between rare diseases or a little bit different and others, there will be less evidence. And what is the right appropriate time for the evaluation? As you said, you have to make some point-in-time decisions for payment. Bluebird's very open to the concept of value-based payment. We've had some prior panels where we discussed this concept with Michael and others. Put your money where your mouth is. If it's valuable, and yes, the evidence is limited right now, let's figure out a way, let's change the system and think about a way that we can show the value and ultimately prove it over time, given that there are limitations. And that the reason we're doing this is there are disease areas that do potentially need these therapies, and we want to plow ahead as a company and try to bring them to patients and not wait for all of that evidence, not wait 15 years to show durability, in that particular example. So
that's great. Thanks. Perry, I'm also interested, you do research. Clinical research on treatments for rare conditions. From your perspective, what are some of the opportunities, I guess, or ways that you think the results of the research should be viewed by those who are trying to assess the value of these treatments?
Speaking specifically about rare disease, right? So, I think, it's growing up in a medical education system where we've really valued large-scale clinical trials, and then ending up in the career path that I have, where it's in rare disease, it really feels like I've kind of switched, the way I've looked at things. But there's definitely a feasibility, practicality to how we can collect evidence. So, I participate in a lot of these clinical trials. Many of them are industry sponsored. And my task is to interface with the patients and to recruit patients. And it's not easy to recruit a lot of patients. I mean, at a large metropolitan area like Los Angeles, sometimes these clinical trials for these rare diseases, I can recruit about 5 patients, and this is a large metropolitan area. So the practicality of looking, I can see the practicality of going global and in a multi-center clinical trial and saying, well, we can probably recruit about 50 patients across the whole world. So then I view the evidence very differently, like, wow, this is a really large study, 40, 50 patients, that's incredible. And like, where did they find all these patients, you know? So no longer am I thinking about, you know, what is it, you know, where's the study that has 1,000 patients or 2,000 patients? You know, I start to think in those scales. And then when you see, you know, the outcome measures that are being assessed, we look at them, and based on somebody who is experienced with these patients, I evaluate based on whether the evidence is really showing something that is definitely off what you would normally expect from the natural course of the disease. And so it really just has to pass that. You know, there has to be some statistical significance, of course, but then it has to pass the common sense test, which is that, you know, I really am convinced that this is a real effect, and that's the level of evidence that I think, as a practical clinician, we start to see. So I think that
do you get the sense? I'm not sure, again, if it's over time, but you know, there are often policy papers done. We've done one on gene therapy where we call for all this work to go into the development phase, where manufacturers will talk with payers and will work with the clinical kind of experts to figure out how to create the best package of evidence that will satisfy not only regulators but others who have kind of decisions to make downstream. Do you feel like we're at that point in your experience? Do you feel like the research was targeted, in a sense, at a shorter term goal of getting through the FDA, or was there a broader view of how it would be used to inform doctors and patients and payers in their decisions?
Well, I think this has been said many times, which is like, you know, a lot of times the researchers they're flying the plane and building it at the same time. And so we don't know exactly how to design these clinical trials, and I don't think anybody can prospectively, before these clinical trials are done, necessarily state that this is the proper way, this is the amount of evidence, that's, you know, this is the, and so sometimes we're developing these methods, and sometimes it's through a failed clinical trial, in theory a failed clinical trial, and then we actually repeat the clinical trial at a later time with appropriate outcome measures that we actually discover that there is a true effect. So it's hard to predict how things are going to turn out 10 years from now, you know, when you have a candidate molecule or candidate drug sometimes.
Right. Okay. Annie, yeah, so let me, you probably have stuff you want to add. I'm going to throw something also at you as a pitch, whether it's a curveball, a fastball at Bryce Harper that we had the other day, or whatever. You know that Sarepta, you know, that Exondys 51 is viewed as kind of a triumph by some and a disaster by others, based on a variety of different factors. But as a critical kind of learning point around the kinds of evidence that are going to be used for decision making, and how value assessors and payers should look at that evidence, what do you think are the lessons learned for us going forward?
So I guess the first thing, so I'm going to answer that and build off of what Perry just said. So the first thing to say that I wanted to say is that before I did policy work, I worked in the neuromuscular clinics for about 10 years, and then also had a personal experience with somebody close to me who had a rare cancer. And so the way I would define rare is if an experienced, accomplished clinician ever walks into the room and says, "You are so interesting." I never in my lifetime want to hear someone say that to me. And the reason for that is, and I'm not joking about it, is because the care delivery is in the nuances, right? And I think everyone in this room knows that. So to have an approved therapy is one thing, but it's around the nuances around how that care is delivered, the clinician-patient interaction, who it's appropriate for, when it's appropriate for that individual. And so there's the definition of rare, but then there's so much in the timing around the delivery of that care, the when it's initiated, when it's stopped, et cetera. So then also to build off of what Perry was just talking about, as far as, you know, when we talk about our rare disease communities, we have our rare disease communities, and then we have the mutation specificity within the communities, and then we have the endpoints within the trials that are further defining who's eligible for those trials and making these trials smaller and smaller and smaller. And I have a colleague who defines it as, we have the people who are able to get on the bus and the people who are at the back of the bus waiting because they don't qualify for the trials. And so we've worked really hard with the FDA through guidance to work for broad labeling so that if we have really defined, small, well-defined endpoints in trials, but we have a threshold of safety and efficacy, so that one standard that Diane had talked about that's been met, that we can have extrapolation and broader labeling for the broader population that will benefit. So with the same mutation, but not in the cohort that participated in the trial. And we've been pleased that in the case of Exondys 51, we saw that happen. So you had a very small cohort of patients who were in that study, but that you had a broader subset of the population, non-ambulatory patients, who were in the label. But where it's difficult is that because it was a 6-minute walk test, right, is that clinical endpoint, but it was approved on a surrogate biomarker, that nobody who wasn't walking was ever going to be able to participate in that 6-minute walk test. And so this is where it gets difficult. This is where that chevron that you showed, where that clinical efficacy is going to be very difficult for ICER. And so the other thing I just want to make sure we understand is that accelerated approval is not a shortcut. So when you ask me about Exondys 51, the boys who were in that study were in that study for 6 years by the time that approval came. So that wasn't a short time frame for those kids to participate in that study. So I just want to make sure that people understand that wasn't 6 months of data that the FDA reviewed. So one of the concerns we have is that there is a lot of other data that goes into product reviews that doesn't show up in labels. There's benefit risk data, there's now PRO data that's being reviewed that we believe could be helpful to payers, to ICER, when making informed decisions about access. And the question is how to make that available.
Good. Well, we have definitely been working with patient groups to try to understand, to kind of address that question. When can we generate that kind of information and how do we bring it in? It tends for us to kind of help more on the kind of other benefits side that we'll talk about a little bit later than helping us directly do clinical comparisons between treatment arms. But again, for some, and here's where rarity probably doesn't capture some of the issues we're talking about, where you've got a very clearly defined natural history of deterioration or death, and you can do a single-arm trial where if they don't do that, you can kind of see it. You don't have to, because you've got a really clearly, again, a very clearly defined time course on the other side. So in terms of patient-reported outcomes, it's obviously an evolving field, and how and when we get access to that information is something that we are working very hard on. Mike, I'm going to come to you next after Vanessa. So Vanessa, tell people what your career is and what you do. You care for children with neuromuscular diseases, correct?
Yes.
So talk to us about, from I guess your perspective, either as a researcher or as a consumer of the research, and how you apply it to your clinical practice. Again, part of what we do is to do these assessments for a broad audience, and we would like to think that our assessment can inform your knowledge of the evidence, your assessment of it in some way too. So tell us what your view on this is.
Thank you. My background is really in neuromuscular disease, and I have spent several years, over 10 years now, I guess, working in a clinical setting, both in the research context of clinical research and RCTs, and as a nurse and then a nurse practitioner in the clinic working with children with neuromuscular disease. Currently, I'm working as a palliative care provider, and so I do see children still with neuromuscular disease, but with a slightly different context. I also see children with, or our team sees children with a variety of different rare diseases, and I think it's poignant because a large part of what we do, probably I'd say 75 to 80% of what we do as the palliative care team is help families set goals and make decisions. And so within that context of making decisions come the big decisions of, just because there is something there, should we do it? Whether that might be a surgery or a treatment or a trial, or you meet a family who has potentially very little time left with their child, and they have to make the decision of whether or not they want to spend that coming to the hospital every day to be in a trial, or trying an experimental drug that they're not quite sure that it's going to work, or trying the drug that's just been approved that may or may not work for their child but might be the only shot that they have. And so I think we constantly make decisions based on evidence, right? We're all trained in evidence-based medicine, and that's what we do, but I think the decision becomes a little bit different when the diseases you're seeing are so rare, and at times there is not a lot of evidence there, and so you're making the decision based on what you have available, what works for that family, because it's going to be different for every family based on all the contextual features, which I know you're going to get to later, and also, as was alluded to before, what's the common sense, like what makes sense for this family. And so I think it's difficult when you think about making these decisions in a rare disease, because when we see diseases that there might be 3 in the world and we've seen all 3 cases, it's rare, but for that family, it's everything, right? It's their child and it's their life. And so how do you say, well, this is rare and there's nothing available? Especially in palliative care, you pull every tool you have in your toolbox and try it, right?
Mm-hmm. All right. No, thank you. So, Michael, I know you have probably multiple thoughts. I want to also just kind of paint a picture for you that is part of the kind of the broader background for those folks in evidence-based medicine, having watched kind of efforts to assess health technologies over 10 or 20 years. There's certain areas where there's literally a history of a practice area like radiation therapy, where the norm was no randomized trials, computer modeling of patient outcomes, and clinicians deciding this is a better treatment. And I know it is because I can see it in my computer simulation. I don't need to do patient studies. That was the norm. And there was kind of a movement over years to kind of work with that clinical research area and manufacturers of radiation therapy machines, especially when we got to proton beam therapy, to kind of say, yes, there is a way for you to do randomized trials. There would be reason to consider doing so. There are standards for doing good clinical randomized trials. And over a number of years, the entire paradigm of what good evidence looked like rose in that practice area. And to this day, you will find outstanding clinical researchers, outstanding quality of RCTs going on in that domain. There is a general sense that it's now, in terms of some kind of orphan and ultra-orphan conditions, that the types of evidence coming before clinicians and payers is on a different trend, that it seems to be less, so that there's more uncertainty about the relationship between surrogate outcomes to true patient-centered outcomes, about the durability of effect. And there's a sense that, so that part of the question is, do we kind of roll with that? Or do we say, no, we need to keep a standard of what a good research study looks like and what a good body of evidence looks like, because we don't want to keep heading one direction. We want to kind of, in a sense, not mirror, but keep consistent so that we can really bring all of the areas in medicine up to a higher understanding of what good evidence should be to guide clinical practice and policy making. So I'm just going to, from a payer's perspective, what's your sense of where the evidence is going in some of the new treatments that we're obviously kind of talking about today? And how do you think about the role that ICER plays, the role that you play in trying to decide what's good enough evidence to cover it, to decide how to cover it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, before I respond, I actually want to follow on to something Vanessa said.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about a case we had just last week. We had one of those ultra-rare genotypes of cystic fibrosis. And the pharmacist actually came to me and they said, there's never going to be a trial for this patient. We'd like to approve Orphan and pay for it for this one patient and see how they do. And we said yes. And it was the right thing to do. And we recognize, we may revisit it in 6 or 12 months, see if we think they're responding. But everyone felt very strongly it felt like the right thing to do for that patient and for all our stakeholders. The information that ICER produces is really important to us, and for some people here, they'd say it's academic, it's interesting intellectually, which is all true. For us, it helps us do business. And I'll add that Steve has graciously met with my leadership team as well as with our pharmacists and the other clinicians who do the health technology assessments and drug assessments to help them understand how to use the information that comes out of ICER. So we use that as well as other types of information from multiple sources, which I won't go into unless there's questions, to come to the right decisions and the right policies. In a perfect world, we would have a high level of data and of evidence for everything we look at. That would be terrific, and when there is that level of evidence, it makes life easier. I'd also remind everyone our goal is not to minimize drug cost. It isn't to keep our members away from high-cost drugs or any drugs. That's not nowhere in our mission statement, and we mean that. But we do get concerned. What we don't want to do is spend money on drugs that are ineffective. And to the extent that the evidence is murky, it makes that goal harder to achieve. To me, the way around this, what you could say, let's just demand a higher level of evidence before, either before doing an ICER review or before our coming up with a policy for approval. I think that's hard to do. That's better being the enemy of good. The problem there is, well, we wait another 5 or 10 years. And again, this is an ethical question. People who could have been helped will not be. And then the other pragmatic fact, which is for some of these ultra rares, there will never be enough individuals for a proper RCT or even a real single arm trial. So that leads you to maybe there is a group for which there's good evidence and we can act appropriately. But more and more with the FDA approvals, we're seeing the approvals expanding beyond the population studied, which really puts the payers in a quandary since when that happens and the drugs are expensive as they tend to be because of the population sizes, it means that we worry about the affordability part of the equation or what everyone's going to pay, which is important as well. So to me, the approach that we try to follow, and again, just being on a practical basis of having to actually make decisions, where the data is good, we tend to, rare or ultra rare or otherwise, fine, we'll come up with appropriate policy. Where there is not, we need to think about tying the payments to effectiveness, whether it is looking at multiple years with the gene therapy companies, because we don't know what the duration is, which I think is preferable to starting now rather than saying come back in 10 years, we'll look at it. Or in cases where there are approvals for a certain type of a rare disease, neuromuscular or otherwise, and there have been a couple of cases of this, as I think people know, by the FDA. So maybe we agree we'll pay in those cases, and others will agree to pay conditionally, something commensurate with the outcome seen. Again, that creates a need for still, even with imperfect data, it's helpful for an ICER, it could be someone else, but ICER is at the forefront, to give us some guidance. What creates a fair value? Now, you have to modify that. One of the points that was made earlier, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, there needs to be a reasonable return to the shareholders to attract capital for something which is risky. So you need to temper it with that and look at the market size and all of the other pieces. But in general, it's helpful to have, through a common model, because my pharmacists are trained in that. If there were different variations, it would make it very, very hard for them to use the data effectively. But tying those outcomes to some sort of value-based payment, hopefully, ideally in a perfect world with some sort of ICER framework wrapped around it, I think is an approach that can bridge the lack of perfect data with our desire to make these drugs appropriately available to those who can benefit.
I noticed, and we'll have time to talk about this too, there's a natural tension between the enthusiasm that Annie felt for a broader label from the FDA that went beyond the specific patients maybe in the studies to the payer perspective, which is that's part of what creates a quandary, because you've got a label here, you've got a clinical study that had these patients, so what do we do with the other patients? And again, clinicians also feel that part of that tension, which is here was the study, I know that study, it's now labeled for more people, so what does that imply in a sense? David, last, our ICER Chief Medical Officer, you've also, he's worked for Up to Date, where he was kind of a senior editor, so he's seen the flow of how evidence is considered by clinical experts as it comes into practice over the years. What's your view on this basic kind of issue of the types of evidence that assessors get, and how do we modulate or not modulate our approach to what strong evidence is?
Sure. So I don't really think it helps anyone if you grade on a curve, change your scheme, because then you can't compare apples to apples. And so you're better off, just from a rating standpoint, if the ICER matrix is the ICER matrix, use it the same way. But at the same time, I think we can get into these problems where what a matrix is talking about, what grade, for instance, is talking about, has to do with certainty. And that gets blurred over into, do we have a randomized trial? Do we have enough patients? What did the p-value look like? And I thought John Watkins' example was a very good one. I can remember, I was an AIDS doctor in the 1990s. I can remember in 1995 the abstract when ritonavir was first studied in 50 patients, and you just looked at what happened to those 50 patients. And by mid-1996, no randomized trial had been done of the cocktails for HIV. You shouldn't think that that somehow meant we didn't have certainty about what was going on. We've learned a lot about how certain study designs prevent us from getting bitten in specific ways, but when you don't actually have problems with certainty, you shouldn't force it in there because you don't have a given trial. If you think about Gleevec, there were articles in Newsweek about how wonderful Gleevec was before any randomized trials had been done, I assume based on the phase 2 data. There are things we know. If you have a devastating disease that's killing infants, and suddenly those infants are living, and their function is changing, you'll notice that. It's much trickier when you have, what do you do with the data on a 6-minute walk test that people have concerns about. I think whatever you do with that, you should rate the evidence the way you really believe the evidence is, not judge the evidence differently because it's a rare disease.
All right, there's one statement. So let me throw it back out to you now. Help ask questions or make comments, and again, advise the field on, in a sense, what David just addressed, which is, how do we reflect, in a sense, the distinctive types of uncertainty that sometimes arise from smaller populations? And do we weave that directly into ratings of the strength of evidence, or do we somehow keep it as a commentary on it? Those kinds of things. We've got a gentleman behind you, and then Pat. Yes.
Thanks. So I think one
Sorry,
thing.
could you introduce
sorry, it's Ian Estepan from Sarepta Therapeutics. And it relates to this topic, but also to what's the difference between rare diseases and not rare disease. And I think one thing that's important is, if we looked at diabetes, right, today, without any of the research, and we looked at people's HbA1c levels, and it was 7.5 and it went to 6.5. I think everyone would say, that sounds pretty ridiculous. How do we know that that's making an impact on the disease? But over the course of the years, we've studied this disease for a very long time. It's a large population. We've had outcome studies. So everyone generally accepts HbA1c levels under 7 is clinically meaningful. We don't have that context in rare diseases, though. So this goes back to what Dr. Shea is looking at, and I think payers also need to really consider talking to experts, because that's the real difference between a rare disease and not, and the level of education that needs to happen to make the appropriate decisions, because you just don't have that context when looking at a rare disease. So looking at dystrophin levels or not, how meaningful is that in the course of the disease? Only expertise that really actually treat DMD, it's not even just neurologists who don't have that perspective. It's really the people who've treated this disease, that you can at least start engaging in medical experts, probably will make a meaningful difference in making these decisions, and so that you don't fall into the traps of just approving drugs which aren't really effective. And that also relates to how broad a label is. I think physicians generally are going to look at the mechanism of action and say, does it make sense for just the patients who are studied in the clinical trial, or is there actual rationale as to why patients outside the clinical trial setting could actually be benefiting by looking at the measurement, whichever you're choosing to measure?
It's important to hear all these perspectives. I know that to a certain set of ears, a mechanism of action, a rationale could be effective for other patients, especially if that's a bigger population and a high-priced drug. That's the tension that we're sensing. Pat?
Pat Goyson, Prime Therapeutics, Pharmacy Benefit Manager. Just a few observations, and I'll just say that second Dr. Rin's statement as to the value of cost-effectiveness analysis in rare diseases and orphan conditions. It's an apples-to-apples comparison, so at least we have a number to work with. I find it essential. Dr. Sherman as well, statements. We're using the ICER reports in decision-making at Prime Therapeutics all the time. And then the level of information actually at the FDA, I mean, I feel like there's some misinformation about the FDA's, at least from my perspective, on the evaluation. It's phase 2 studies they're approving these drugs with, not phase 3. So they're getting approved with phase 2 studies, and they're really giving a pass on adverse events because we really don't know because of the numbers. So the FDA with phase 3 studies in more common conditions are spending a lot of time looking at adverse events, where in rare conditions, they're not. They're not able to. So we've given these drugs a pass on their adverse event effects. And let's just accept that, and I'm willing to accept that, but that's real. So I think that's important to keep in the context of the conversation as well, because the contextual consideration is that really these have no adverse events unless they're common enough to be seen in 50 people or 20 people, which is not true. And then I guess I'll just say that the point on, I think I forgot my last point, I apologize. So I'll just, I know, I'm sorry, I apologize. I'd like to know, especially the clinicians on the panel, starting and stopping rules. Right. That would be extremely, it was in your document, we haven't talked about that. I don't know if it's for a later conversation, so if it is, that's fine, we can table it. But we would find it extremely helpful to have starting and stopping rules, especially provided by the specialty organizations like, and Dr. Perry, who's doing the clinical trials, help us understand who to start, and most importantly, to Dr. Sherman's point about his Orkambi patient, help us understand when we should be saying stop.
Right. That topic is a really critical part of translating the evidence into coverage policy and into clinical practice. It's a tiny bit, I mean, we always do that as part of our ICER meetings too. It's a tiny bit beyond the scope of what we're trying to cover here, but it's good for people to hear this is what, payers are wrestling with this, with the tension. Again, one of the ways that international groups, almost every single one that I'm aware of, where they have a formalized process for decision making for rare and ultra rare, they focus a lot on stopping rules. Obviously on criteria to start, but they have very clearly defined stopping rules as part of their approach to kind of management of those cases. Any response? Yes, Annie, Michael.
Just a couple of responses. I guess the first thing I just want to clarify is to make sure that people understand that, I can speak for our patient community and probably for a couple others, that we're not asking for the bar to be lowered, right? We want blockbuster therapies. We want there to be cures, although we shy away from that word. We want there to be really good therapies for our patients, and we don't want that bar to be used as a limbo stick. So I think that's really important to put out there. And as far as the question around safety and adverse events and trials, the first thing is in these diseases and the ones we've used as the examples in Pompe and Duchenne and SMA, especially in the SMA1 trial, doing nothing is the ultimate harm in these diseases. And the FDA recognized that in reviewing at least the trials that I was involved in. And so there are post-market requirements for some of these trials and post-market commitments for others for safety tracking. So it's not that that's just been tossed out the window, and there are reporting requirements for that. So the patient community is very concerned about safety, absolutely, but what we know will happen is that our patients are going to lose function and in some cases rapidly die if we don't do anything. So that when we hit the safety threshold in these clinical trials, the patients were very interested in access to the approved therapies.
I just want to respond to the first comment about some of the measures. And yes, it is a lot harder for us and we struggle when we're talking about things that we're not used to, things like dystrophin levels or 6-minute walking test or whatever. And we do speak with experts and patient groups trying to understand what actually makes a difference, what's material, what isn't. So that's really important. The other thing I want to mention is it's helpful to have discussions early. So we had a meeting with a biotech company a week or two ago, and they instigated the meeting. They have a drug. I don't know if it's ultra rare or just pretty rare at the extreme, but it is uncommon. That they're going into their phase 3, and they actually took the trouble to meet, and they said, we want to position ourselves for positive coverage, whether it's thinking about a broad policy or what you would tie outcomes based if there is conditional payment. What are some of the measures that you would accept? And they actually threw out some ideas, and we responded about which felt how hard were they to measure? Do we think they were reproducible? We actually had a dialogue together which informed what they're going to look at, and we agreed to stay in touch. And I think, and I mentioned the company's name if I had permission, but I don't. But I would commend them for the foresight to trying to get ahead of this and speak with payers about what can we all agree upon, rather than coming out with something and then occasionally seeing suspicion as to whether it is meaningful or not.
Yes, Barry.
Yeah, so I'll just make one comment about generalizability about clinical trials. I mean, we're in this space, and there's an inherent difficulty in actually running these clinical trials with outcome measures that are applicable across all age groups, and we have to be rather creative. Younger patients, older patients, and particularly in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, when we're looking at the 6-minute walk test, we actually have to look at patients only in a specific window if we're going to use this outcome measure. So, for instance, ages 7 through 14 is usually the age group where you're actually going to get a decreasing 6-minute walk test. In patients who are less than 7 years of age, they're actually increasing 6-minute walk tests, even in the patients who have Duchenne muscular dystrophy, because they're getting taller and they're getting more coordinated. So, in terms of the generalizability of the data, even though the studies oftentimes are being done in patients who are ages 7 through 14, we don't believe that that's appropriate to restrict, a drug which we believe is effective actually only into this age group. So, in terms of generalizability, it's the mechanism of action makes a lot more sense. We apply the proximate pathophysiology and the mechanism of action, and based on the data that shows that there is an effect, we generalize to other age groups.
All right, thanks. I think there was one more question, and then we'll shift to the next panel. Did you have a question or comment?
As a father of a son with Duchenne's, I just wanted to tag on to what Annie said, and that is that ultimately the cost of doing nothing is extremely measurable and very much trumped by some of the lower risks perceived by parents in the studies. But on top of that, the known therapies or the standards of care that exist, i.e. steroids, have extreme costs, and we give them to children every day, yet every single one of us would be heartbroken if our child had to be on them. So ultimately, we're also looking for more novel things and opportunities for our kids that have lesser burden than the even perceived standard of care.
All right, thanks. I want to make sure we have enough time for the next panel, and then so we may have to come back to your comment or question later. So thank you to this panel and involved in those. All right, rapidly we will shift to issue number 3, which is other benefits or disadvantages. So could those panelists come up, please? And I will give you a little bit of an intro to that topic as they are coming on up. Let me just throw up the slide, though. Great. So I'll introduce them as individuals. But again, what do we mean by this? If you think, and for some of you it's very, very easy to do this, there is the data from a clinical trial. It may be framed around a surrogate outcome. It may be framed around a hard, if you will, patient-centered outcome. An incremental cost-effectiveness model takes that outcome and all of the harms that we can kind of estimate and spins that out over years. As part of that, we try to capture, again, clinical outcomes and how that relates to the quality of life and the costs of different treatments, visits, hospitalizations, et cetera. So we get that evidence together and we come to a meeting, and other benefits or disadvantages are in a sense, what's not in that package. And I have a list. I'll go ahead and do that now. This is a current list. As many of you know, ICER has been updating its own approach to our value framework for all treatments and health system interventions. And we've been trying to figure out how to be more explicit with a list of other benefits, because up till now, we've had a rough list and we've let our independent counsels try to bring in this information and hear it from stakeholders, et cetera. But we're trying to devise an approach that will make it, in a sense, more transparent and more routine in a way. So consider this list of 7 other benefits or disadvantages for now. This intervention provides significant direct patient health benefits that are not adequately captured by the QALY, right? So for some reason, there's some aspect of health to the patient that the QALY is not catching in the way that it's determined. Number 2, this intervention offers reduced complexity of the regimen that will significantly improve patient outcomes. Again, you can imagine in a clinical trial setting where the patients are micromanaged, they get the treatment, they don't get the treatment. But in the real world, this is in a sense a potential other benefit, reduced complexity compared to other options. Number 3, this intervention will reduce important health disparities across racial, ethnic, gender, socioeconomic, or regional categories. So that may sound like an ethical, but it's in a sense another benefit that a treatment might bring to reduce the gaps across different groups in society. Number 4, this intervention will significantly reduce caregiver burden. That is rarely captured in a formal cost-effectiveness model, partly because it's very hard to get those data, and sometimes there's a question of whether it's fair to include that and not include it for other things. Number 5, this intervention offers a novel mechanism of action or approach that will allow successful treatment of many patients who have failed other available treatments. That's meant to say that you can look at its average effectiveness, but perhaps because it's doing it differently, you can take patients who will have failed another treatment with the same average results, but a lot of those patients who failed will respond to this new treatment. Another potential other benefit is this intervention will have a significant impact on improving return to work and/or overall productivity. Again, not something that you're likely to find in the clinical trial data, and sometimes not in an economic model as well. And then we have a grab bag, other important benefits or disadvantages not otherwise described. So I would encourage you to help us by thinking of this as a draft list of other benefits for every condition, every intervention. It wouldn't have to be a drug. It could be a change to the staffing. It could be integration of behavioral health into primary care, all of the things that are kind of happening in our healthcare system. What I'd love to do is to focus on, are there certain elements of these that really for ultra-rare or rare conditions are very, very important or different in some way? And very importantly, are there other benefits that are specific to rare diseases that aren't on that list that we might want to consider breaking out of the other grab bag at the end and stating for ultra-rare, we're going to look at this additional set of other benefits that aren't captured here currently. So that's the goal. This is the kind of stepping outside the comparative clinical effectiveness and stepping outside the incremental cost effectiveness. How do we at ICER and payers and others weave in a consideration of other benefits or disadvantages in a way that will be important in the decision making by, again, clinicians, patients, and certainly by payers. So with that, let me introduce our panel. We have Liz Cobbs, who's the Executive Director of HTA Strategy at Merck, Kim Lenz, who is the Clinical Pharmacy Manager for Mass Health. I almost said here in Massachusetts, because that's usually where I think I'm doing these things. Beth Moore, who is a parent of 2 children with SMA. Tom Mauser at the end, who's a parent of a child with DMD. And Gordon Smith, who's a professor of neurology, and he cares for patients with neuromuscular disorders at the University of Utah School of Medicine. So thank you for all of you. So I hope my introduction, and we've talked a little bit about this before, I know, but I hope that helped you understand a little bit about what we're grappling with. So I'd love to start with the parents, because again, if anybody's going to be aware of other benefits that we might, not know about or might not perceive in the same way, you guys are ground zero for that. So I'd love your thoughts on this approach and what you think of it. How can we fine-tune it for rare and ultra-rare conditions? Beth? I think you have to hit the button, yeah.
Come on, okay. Well, I have 2 children. My oldest is almost 6, and he has what I would call typical type 1 SMA. He was ventilator dependent at 1 month and trached and never moved anything, never held his head. So that's my one side. And then my other child is about to be 23 months old, and she's been on the Spinraza drug since she was 2 weeks old, and does not require any intervention of any kind at this point. She takes independent steps and talks and breathes and eats on her own. So I have 2 completely different perspectives on SMA. With the introduction of the drug 2 years ago, Spinraza, and enrolling my daughter in that, just brought hope to so much in our community. So things that are not measurable, I mean, just the fact that living every single day with a child, I mean, he's not enrolled in hospice, but my son has made it almost 6 years, and living every single day not knowing if that is his last. I mean, the emotional and physical toll that takes on everybody in the family. I don't know how you would measure that on your data analysis, but whenever my son was able to enroll in getting in the expanded access program of the Spinraza, he does not qualify under our private health care terms to receive the drug paid for by them because he has invasive ventilation. So he was able to enroll in an expanded access program, and the day he got the drug, we say, is the first day of the rest of his life, because he has a drug that was constantly, every day he was getting weaker and weaker, and now he has this opportunity to reverse that, you know, to either stay the same or get stronger, and so that just comes with so much more emotional. I don't know what emotional impact than you would even be able to see. I don't know exactly what you're looking for beyond that from me. I mean, my son requires 24/7 care around the clock. I mean, he can't move, so we move him at night. He can't breathe, so he can't swallow, so we have to suction him around the clock. So that is, I mean, it's basically like having, if you can remember having a newborn, it's basically like having a newborn for 6 years. Right. And so for me, my hopes for him on the drug might be, I mean, I think it would be really awesome if I didn't have to suction him at night, you know, and we could both sleep through the night. That would be a benefit in my mind. Since he's received the drug, he's started to learn how to manage his secretions. So he's not drooling on himself as much, and he's preparing to go to kindergarten. He's very excited about that, and just the fact that he won't have to wear maybe a bib to kindergarten would be a positive thing in my mind. And I know you guys look at it from these larger perspective than I have, but these small things are very important, and they improve his quality of life and my quality of life as the caregiver.
Thank you. I almost don't know how to continue, because it's very moving, and it speaks to, you know, you heard from some of the payers when they hear individual cases, and sometimes at the ultra rare end of the spectrum, they feel like they need to hear the detail in order to kind of make a wise judgment. But it's daunting to kind of figure out how to do justice to what you've just said in a process that's going to lead to a black and white report and is going to be talking about groups. It's daunting. But hearing it, and you're kind of sharing it with us, it's already kind of made me think, and we'll talk more about how do we capture that. Is there a quantitative way to capture that? If it's qualitative, does a report have a video link? How do we do this to help inform, you know, decision making across a variety of different perspectives? So I want to, we'll keep going, and then we'll involve the audience as well, but thank you very much. Tom, would you like to? Follow on?
Yeah, I think ultimately this has really provoked a lot of thought with me. I definitely have a bias as a father of Jonathan, who's 7. But ultimately, I think even that aside, there has always been something that was spoken to. We kind of have a bend towards children, that something's different about children. And I think Jonathan has, he's driven that home in my life because I have seen the power behind a child. The community, everybody who knows Jonathan is impacted in a way that is beyond description. And honestly, when I look at him and I look at his class, so he's in 1st grade and his class is amazing. But the teachers say that class is amazing because Jonathan is in that class, and Jonathan has talked to his class about his disability. Jonathan has made friends. I think that impact is very hard to quantify. I think also the vulnerability of children is unique. And I was thinking through, when you talk about a rare condition, it doesn't, everybody with a rare condition maybe doesn't have the same vulnerability. For instance, they don't have the same access. As a palliative care physician, I take care of people every day who have rare genotypes of cancer. But any oncologist in town knows how to deal and care for that cancer. And they're not scared away by it. Jonathan had a bad ankle sprain last week, and pediatricians are all unsure what to do with him. And PPMD has helped, lead a charge in educating people, but there is a vulnerability when you have to fly across 3 states to have access to standard of care. The fact that a parent would fly across 3 states every week for a clinical trial speaks to that. I also think that the impact on the family is something that is very hard to quantify. Ultimately, if you talk about a utilitarian approach in philosophy, what is the best for society? I think we would argue that our children are our future and our children are our hope. Ultimately, when Jonathan has hope and when Jonathan is getting something that is helping him or avoiding something that could harm him, it impacts my other children in ways that are very measurable. Tommy and Sarah do better in many ways, both with mood, temperament, academics. Tommy and Sarah are powerful. If you meet siblings of kids with disabilities, they are producers. They are powerful. They are influencers. And again, I think it rubs off on anybody they encounter. Sarah was sharing that a group of World War II veterans surrounded her kids the other day. That speaks to the power behind children and children with disabilities. And I think that on a whole, as we talk about these concepts, we talk about rare disease, we talk about where should resources go, we need to consider the impact those kids have and the fallout that can happen when those kids are not cared for, not just in the family, but in the community and in the potentials for all those involved.
Right. Thank you. So in both of what you've brought to us today, there's a lot about, somehow now even the term caregiver burden feels kind of distant and inappropriate, but it's the impact on the family, but even as you said, on school classroom, on the broader community that is important to somehow at least recognize as a potential other benefit. And again, it may be something special to rarity, insofar as rarity is associated with a childhood illness, so that's part of what we're thinking in terms of numbers. Numbers doesn't capture everything, so we have to kind of think broadly about the different kind of criteria here. Kim, can I just, maybe, you're going to have to talk about something probably very different in a way, but from your role, how do you think other benefits or disadvantages should be brought into a value assessment report or into the kind of decision-making process around new treatments?
Thanks. I think I would echo everything that Michael Sherman said on the last panel to start. I think those were some great points. And, you know, we, in the Medicaid program in Massachusetts, we use the ICER reports all the time, looking at, you know, the evidence there is and the value that there is in the drug. As far as creating a framework, I think when you asked the question at the beginning, you know, do you think that it needs to be distinctly different, or would you like it to be the same? I think, I didn't raise my hand because I think I'm kind of down the middle on it, but I think I would lean towards it being the same for similar reasons. I think that Pat Gleason had just mentioned about you need to kind of be able to compare things. Like, I think a good example, and it tags back to what you're saying here is things for us to consider, is when we see, you know, a drug come to market that offers a significant advantage, or, you know, patients who had failed previous therapy, I think we value that a little bit different. Hepatitis C was a great example of that, right? So drugs that peg interferon and ribavirin, there was a very high failure rate. We spent, you know, the same, when we did the evaluation, it was like the same cost per cure for therapy because the SVR was so low. So when there's a significant advantage for a drug that's brought to market, I think we value that different. When we're looking at some of these rare conditions where the endpoints and the clinical trials and everything are murky, or we're not exactly sure how to interpret the results for a clinical benefit, we are kind of at this stuck thing. So we do take, you know, contextual things into consideration. So we have seen, you know, prior authorizations submitted in the Medicaid program where the prescriber has really laid out a very clear picture as to the benefits that the family is seeing from the medication. You know, and we use that to help guide our decision making, right. But I won't say that it's very clear cut. So I think you had called it a organized way for individual consideration. I would say that that's kind of, you know, what we use in these circumstances, especially when the, you know, the clinical benefit has not clearly been demonstrated. I'm not sure, you know, what else I can add, but you know, it comes down to, at the end, if we don't have anything else to guide us, we do have to struggle with, you know, what Michael said, with the finance behind it and how do we afford it. And in the Medicaid system, like Dan had pointed out earlier, you know, we have a disproportionate number of patients who are affected. So we're constantly struggling with every single week we're being asked, how are we going to do this? And we're using all the levers that we have to try to work with the system.
Yeah. Do you ever sense, I never really thought of it this way, but you're not a huge Medicaid program, not like California or New York perhaps, but do you ever get the sense, given that you have you know, these kind of organized individual considerations, is there ever a sense of orphan fatigue where you actually have, so with the increased number of orphan treatments coming through, does it feel like it's snowballing and it's no longer kind of a process where case by case seems to make sense? I mean, is there any, I just was kind of curious about, because it can be very time intensive to treat each case individually as the number of orphan treatments expands.
I mean, we're 1.8 million members across the state of Massachusetts. We have an internal PCC plan, and then we have 6 managed care organizations. So we cover about 30% of the lives in Massachusetts. But as far as your point about, you know, does it snowball? Yes, there is fatigue because we can only, you know, you can only have a program, you know, with staffed by clinical pharmacists and physicians who can review so much at a time. We have a 24-hour compliance time, so we are fatigued in that. So we do have, as far as the organized part of the individual consideration, we have basic parameters. So, you know, FDA labeling, and then to the points that we've been bringing up today, we use the labeling, which generally is broader, but we really are digging into the clinical trials to say, where was it effective? So you may have gotten the labeling for this group of patients, but where has it been shown to actually do something meaningful? So we have that, we have criteria there. And then the individual consideration part is, you know, they've met certain criteria and now there's this additional thing that I think Michael talked about with the cystic fibrosis, where our clinical pharmacists will bring it to our attention and say, this feels different to me. And we have, you know, physicians who call the physicians and talk about it, and, you know, we discuss the cases like that.
All right, thanks. Gordon, let me go to you. Well, you've thought about this from a policy perspective as well, but from a clinical perspective, thinking specifically about other benefits or disadvantages, do we capture them all here adequately? Are there, again, nuances to them or additional other benefits that you think need to be considered when we're talking about these new treatments?
Probably not. Yes and yes, I guess would be my response to that. I think this is really important, and thinking about it, first of all, Kim, thank you for going after Beth and Tom so I didn't have to, because that's an incredibly hard act to follow. But I think Beth's description is incredibly powerful. I think all too often we focus on, I mean, you focus on policy and quantitative data and value and cost, and as clinicians we focus on biomarkers and 6-minute walk tests and so forth. But all too often we both forget the psychosocial milieu and the emotional milieu in which disease exists. And you know, I think Beth's example was the one I was going to give had she not. I just saw a family the other day that actually integrated what Tom talked about, who flew all the way from Louisiana to see our SMA team, and the same story. A older sibling passed away, younger sibling now looks normal at 8 months. And you know, everyone goes into that room and almost bursts into tears of joy. And I don't know how you quantitate that. I also don't know that that's unique to rare disease. If you know, one of the antisense therapies for ALS is effective, we'll have the same kind of response. And so in thinking about what's unique about rare disease, I think of rare diseases, and I agree with Tom, they're rare diseases and they're rare diseases, that these populations are at-risk populations because they don't benefit from the economies of scale that, let's say, our Alzheimer's families benefit from, and that may be community resources to care for the patients, or the very real issue of accessing care and flying across the country, which you know is incredibly common, and so I think those issues are important. I don't know quite how to quantitate them. I think there are issues at a system level too, and these are. This goes towards implementation science, I suspect, and I think Perry is probably experiencing the same thing at UCLA, but we're really struggling now how to actually deploy Speranza in our clinical practice and all levels. So, you know, our health system is trying to figure out how do we pay for this, how are we going to offer this to individual patients, but how are we actually administering it? And the burden on the system to figure this out is significant. And looking down the road, we're going to benefit from an embarrassment of riches. And so I think that probably does disproportionately affect rare disease patients, and that I know our pediatric neuromuscular team is spending an extraordinary amount of time on this, and their time is finite. And that means that they may be spending more time trying to figure out the logistics and not you know, using their time to address other rare disease needs. And so I think the need to think of this systematically is important. And I think the other thing that Beth pointed out that I think is really critically important is we need far better assessment measures for patient-reported outcomes. And I know that there's been a real push towards this at, I think, both FDA and NIH, and there are people actively working on this. There are unique challenges in rare diseases for reasons that have been pointed out earlier, and there are equally difficult challenges in measuring patient-reported outcomes in children. So I don't know if that's helpful. I don't know what the right answer is, but I think these things are really important, particularly, you know, Beth's description is, I think, it's almost, I don't know, it's an incredibly powerful example of the various issues that we don't measure that, you know, you can feel and see. I don't know how you put a value on what, you know, Beth's family is going through right now.
Great, thank you. Sure, would you like to? Sure.
Something that Gordon and Tom both mentioned is I feel like they keep talking about, you know, well, the trials were only done on this particular set of kids or whatever. Well, my son, he was not eligible for a trial because he has invasive ventilation. Well, part of the reason my son has invasive ventilation was he has a rare disease. And whenever he was really small, it took a long time to diagnose him. We didn't know anything about the standard of care that Cure SMA has put out. We didn't know about extubation protocols. We didn't know about things like that because it's a rare disease. So before my son was even really properly diagnosed, he was diagnosed with several other things before. Before he was properly diagnosed with SMA, he was trached. I don't regret that. I feel like that's part of the reason he's here today is we had a really good airway established at a young age. But he might not have needed invasive ventilation if we had known more about SMA and how to care for it a long time ago, 6 years ago. But because of that decision we made before we even got our official diagnosis, he was excluded from trials, which I get. Kids that are older and have invasive ventilation come with a lot more variables, so they are not the ideal candidates for trials. But why does that make him not eligible for his insurance to pay for him to get the medicine, whereas his sister gets to have it and run around and be a typical child? My son doesn't get that opportunity because he has invasive ventilation from a lack of knowing how to care for him because he has rare disease, if that makes sense. So the fact that the FDA approved it for all type 1s, I think for all types actually, but the FDA approved it for my son, but his specific insurance is the one that decided that he didn't get to have that opportunity. And thankfully there was an expanded access program and Biogen gifts the medicine to him, but and so he's able to have that opportunity now. But there's so many kids just like him that weren't. There were 5 kids in Texas that got in the EAP, and I feel very blessed my son was one. But I see kids every single day, just like my son, who maybe followed the path of not understanding how to care for him correctly because of a rare disease, and now they're in the same boat and they can't get the medicine. They don't get that opportunity because their insurance company can't pay for it or doesn't want to pay for it, or...
Well, that's part of the tension. I want to let Liz comment, and then I want to make sure we have time for the audience. Do you have a brief follow-on?
I just have a quick follow. Am I on? Yeah, that I think is really important because I think access to even a modestly effective drug, which is first for a particular rare disease, really builds community, and I've seen this among a number of diseases. And we certainly are seeing SMA kids come out of the woodwork and traveling to Salt Lake City that we didn't even know were in the region. And I think that there are almost certainly fantastic benefits in terms of providing the kind of sophisticated care to families who might have been hopeless about this or lost, and in educating the community about the disease. Clearly, there are a lot more people who know about SMA now than there were 6 months ago.
Liz, obviously you can comment on any of this rich discussion. Also, from a manufacturer's perspective, I'd be interested to, do we have these other benefits right, or are there some up there that you would modify or add to this list?
Well, I think after this discussion, it's really hard for a pharmaceutical perspective to take on any deep meaning. So I would like to really tailor the comments. In terms of the list, I think the list varies based on the patient's perspective, so that the weight of any of these additional benefits or disadvantages would have to be counted differently based on the patient perspective. And I think from a pharmaceutical perspective, one of the things that's hard is the timing of when this data can be available. So patient-reported outcomes that can be pulled back through into a clinical trial setting is only one aspect of what's been covered here in this dialogue. And so that's something I don't think that we've yet hit on, is when is the timing and when do you have these assessments? So at this point in time, ICER's assessment it's a one-time assessment. But the data continues to develop and evolve as we learn more about the patients and what can they benefit in the ways that were described here. So I'm wondering how we can, continuously look and build this list from those experiences. And really that, I think, would bring more of a patient-centered approach to the data, and not have it sit really with the pharmaceutical industry even. There was one comment I wanted to address from the last panel with Michael Sherman mentioned that a company had come to talk about their pipeline. And those are things that we're very cautious from an industry perspective to do because of limitations on what data we're able to share. And so that I just wanted to flag that as an issue for us too, in terms of how and when we can share data, and when so that's also a timing point, right?
Right,
How and when can we share data? And then what data is available when? And I think those are very important as we look from a patient perspective on this. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks. Sure, sure. Should be. Yep,
Hello?
you're on.
Yes, yeah, just to clarify, there was no data presented. The question was, what data elements should they collect that would be of value to us and lead to our being able to better evaluate the drug and tie payment outcomes. So I don't think that's prohibited under the current rules of engagement. I'd also add that part of the reason there was a comfort level is that we had met at meetings, ICERs and others, so you know it's all about the relationships and having that comfort where we can talk candidly.
Great. All right, so let's go out into the audience, again, thinking about other benefits, reaction to the comments here. John, and then we'll come up to you.
Thanks. And before I say what I was going to say, that last point I think is important, that payers also are frustrated with requests to cover expanded screening. And I think it's really important to understand the value of that and make the case for it, because it's so common with these disorders that it takes a couple of years to get a diagnosis. You work your way through the system, you start out getting told that it's okay, it'll be fine, just don't worry about it, and then eventually you get there. But we are really just beginning a patient journey or patient understanding journey. And I have to thank ICER for first really bringing this to my awareness. It's meetings like this that first started raising my consciousness. But I really value in the ICER reports when you include a summary of what you've learned from the patients in the process, because I can copy that into my monograph, and you have resources I don't. I'm attempting to see what I can do with zero dedicated budget, so we'll see. But to begin with, in this particular instance, we started by making contact with Vanessa's counterparts at Seattle Children's. They have now given me a referral to a patient mom like Beth, who has graciously agreed to have lunch with us middle of June. And so we just want to understand the things that you were sharing about what a day looks like, how you get through it, what could we do to make things better. And one aha just at the very beginning is the payer traditional knee-jerk is, well, if they can't walk for 6 minutes, forget it. We learned immediately that if you have a patient that is wheelchair bound but otherwise fairly functional, arm strength is a huge, very important metric, because that determines what you can do for yourself versus what you have to have done for you. And just, I wouldn't have thought of just the ability to lift something to your mouth and feed yourself. It's a big deal. So we really value that. I think that maybe payers need more training in how to work with your reports. And hopefully we're going to learn more as we go forward. But as a clinician and an EBM person, I've felt for years that the evidence really is a black and white picture, and it's up to the patients and the clinicians that deal with them to paint the colors for me. I can't really make the right decision if I don't have that full picture. So this is really useful, and I hope you will dig deeper into it.
Thank you, John. Kenneth.
So I'm Kenneth Hobby from Cure SMA, and I think one thing that stands out when you tie this to the rarity part rather than just kind of the medical severity is, I heard it a couple of times, kind of the uncertainty, the unknowns. And I think what we see, especially in SMA, but I think this is the rare disease side, it's the caregiver, the parents that have to become the experts. And the burden that you're seeing there is extreme. So it's the parent that has to become the expert about care, medical decisions, insurance, education. And I think it's that burden, which I know parents, Tom, Beth, are never going to call it a burden, but it's incredible that knowledge, that expertise that a parent in a rare disease has to take on. And if that's relieved by a therapy, that's one thing.
Right.
But it's also actually, this is what, Gordon, what you were saying, when you get a therapy, it brings a bigger community together. And that in itself, the awareness with medical experts, the broader community about a disease, helps those parents. It actually removes that burden along with the actual therapy itself.
Oh, thanks. That's not a perspective on our usual list that I'd actually thought of in the same way. So in one sense, a new treatment can even create more burden in the short term as people try to flurry around to get access to it, to make sure they understand all the different bells and whistles of getting treatment or insurance coverage, et cetera. But over the other points you talk about the potential longer term, certainly benefits of reducing the intense need for each parent to be the world's best expert on X, Y, or Z by themselves. That's very helpful. Thank you. Oh, sure, Tom, please.
So I would echo that. So I'm a doc. I'm an internist. And training in palliative care. I deal with chronic and serious illness all day long. But Sarah's the expert. She's walked a road that I have not. That I will go down some of the same paths. But the reality is I have learned so much from the parents, from the non-medical, medically trained parents who have walked this road, because it is not a road that we are taught how to walk, and there are so many unknowns, and ultimately the value that has come in being in this realm of clinical trials and things, in networking with other parents, meeting other providers, getting different perspectives from other physicians is priceless.
Priceless. Careful with that term. Careful with that. That's for after lunch, the priceless part. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, but it was too hard not to do that. All right. We're getting close to lunchtime, and it's Washington, D.C. Most meetings here break for lunch by noon because people are usually just checked out by then. You guys have not been. It's been a great discussion so far. Do we have another couple questions, and then we will break for an hour's lunch? Anybody have any comments or questions? David.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to thank Beth and Tom. The journey in figuring out what you've got or what your kids got is, given clinical variation and the failure of professionals to recognize correctly and diagnose disease, is terrible. It's terrible for adults. It's awful when it's a child. So thanks for being here and expressing and sharing your experience. I want to compliment ICER big time for its increasing focus on these elements. When you live with and manage a disease, these things are very, very important. I was on a drug for 5.5 years that included nasty side effects like birth defects if I impregnated a woman, blood clots. I got one, so they took me off of it. Peripheral neuropathy. Then there's steroid load when they use steroids in combination with other drugs, which they frequently do in a variety of diseases, certainly cancer. Then there's a unique mechanism of action up there. The drug I'm on now, one of the two drugs I'm on now, is a monoclonal antibody that's like Pac-Man. In my mind, that's how I visualize it. It goes and hunts for CD38 receptors, which overexpress on myeloma cells, and then it kills them. I have to go for 4.5 hours of infusion when they give it to me, and they have to give me a bunch of other drugs with it to avoid infusion reactions. But the point is, completely unique mechanism of action that is keeping me alive when other drugs can't or won't be used right now. And even though I have to go get the infusion, otherwise no side effects, much better compared to blood clots, birth defects, peripheral neuropathy, diarrhea. So these features from a patient perspective being taken into account that allow you to look at the unique benefits that may accrue to individual patients, but which can also range across populations of patients, is really important in terms of making what you produce useful for real human beings addressing and living with real disease every day. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to ask a provocative question that you can think about now, and we may want to come back to it later. But it's all about some kind of tension or balance. So, we've had some folks watching our process as it is evolving, and there can be a concern that the evidence will somehow get swamped by testimony about, from families and patients, and then it becomes a difficult process, and certainly in a public meeting, to manage what feels like a theatrical element that becomes very important in decision making. Now, I'm using the most provocative terms because what we've just heard is a very powerful statement of why this is central to the ICER report and to our process. But we also have to try to modulate how we bring it into the process in a way that feels fair to everybody. And again, rarity, there's nothing special about many of these things. I think Kenneth's perspective was very helpful. But for a lot of very common conditions, there will be very important considerations in all of these. And so the question is, how do we bring that into the process, and whose job is it to try to integrate it with the evidence and try to make some judgments? So we'll come back to that actually when we talk about the guiding principles for what we hope to come away with today. But as we've all kind of felt the power of this for the past 45 minutes, I just wanted to put a signpost that we have to figure out how we weave this into a mix of other factors as well. So I want to thank our panelists so much for coming and sharing with us their stories and their perspective. Thank you.